Cairo, Egypt, the 1st of October 1970. The funeral of President Jamal Abdel Nasser brought millions onto the streets of the capital. But even as the nation mourned, plans were already being made for his successor.
During the condolences, some of the ladies whispered in my ear saying, "Congratulations, your husband will be president." I swear to God, I did not even reply to them saying thank you.
And within 2 weeks of Nasser's death, Anwar Sadat had been confirmed as the new president. But would he live up to Nasser's legend, or would he create a new one? Mohammed Anwar al-Sadat was born on December the 25th, 1918, into a modest family in one of the poor villages in the Nile Delta. Sadat had been influenced from an early age by nationalist politicians such as Turkey's Kemal Ataturk. Hoping to help end British occupation of his country, Sadat joined the Egyptian army, graduating from the military academy as a lieutenant at the age of 20. But being an officer didn't prevent him from joining underground resistance movements. And he paid a high price for this involvement. With World War II raging, Sadat calculated that Egypt's best chance of throwing off British rule lay with a German invasion. In 1942, he was accused of consorting with a Nazi spy network in Cairo, fired from the army and imprisoned.
He could have lived a good life like his colleagues. He was married and had 3 daughters, but he got involved in politics and sacrificed his post and career. He suffered a lot for the sake of his country.
After almost 6 years of arrest and pursuit, Sadat was finally released from prison in 1948. The same day, he met his future second wife, Jihan, and married her in May 1949.
I saw him and fell in love with him, even though he had no job, no money, and an unknown future. I regarded him as a patriot who loved Egypt.
And this love led him to join the nationalist Free Officers Movement, founded in 1948 by his colleague Jamal Abdel Nasser, even though his political affiliations had once threatened to destroy his life. In July 1952, the young officers carried out a military coup that culminated in the overthrow of King Farouk, subsequently ending more than 70 years of British colonization. But as the revolutionaries turned into politicians and rulers, Sadat remained in the shadows.
Anwar al-Sadat didn't enter conflicts. He didn't fight over power. He didn't want to be a minister. He wasn't hoping for a post. And Nasser was watching this throughout these years, from 1952 to 1969.
And it may have been this very characteristic that led him to power. In 1969, Sadat was chosen by Nasser as his vice president. And within a year, he would be president. Sadat inherited a nation in turmoil, one whose army was still reeling from its crushing defeat to Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967.
It was a depressing period because Israel was occupying Sinai, an important historical part of Egypt, and we could not liberate it. We were all frustrated, all alike, military men or civil.
Sadat knew full well the heavy cost inflicted by Israel. Yet, he also knew that the potential cost of another war to liberate Sinai could be even greater. So, in February 1971, he set out his terms for a deal with the Israelis. But the Israeli government dismissed the proposal out of hand.
Sadat was a new president. Nobody knew how stable his rule of Egypt is. The general impression from him at the beginning was very negative. He's not serious. He's not a Nasser. He's not a leader. He's probably a transitional solution for the Egyptian state.
Sadat remained unproven on the international stage, and at home, the dissenting voices grew even louder.
Who brought Sadat? It was Nasser's crew who ruled at the time. They were holding all the power in their hands. They picked Sadat themselves, and it was a huge mistake from their side. It was a wrong choice. They thought Sadat was a weak man, and they could rule behind the scene.
I went as far as telling him, "What are you waiting for? Are you waiting till they come and get you?" The conspiracy was so glaring, clear, and they were not hiding it. But he would nod so calmly. In that way, he was killing me sometimes. And he would say, "I know what I'm doing. I understand."
In May 1971, Sadat showed that his perceived weakness was in fact his greatest strength. All his opponents were arrested, charged with treason, and handed long prison sentences.
He did not feel that he was the true ruler in charge of Egypt until he got rid of this group, which he called power centers, and put them in prison. After that, he was relieved and started to work and focus on what he should be doing.
Having won the power struggle at home, Sadat switched once again to international affairs. The Egyptian military had been severely weakened by the Six-Day War, and Sadat turned to the Soviets in an attempt to continue rebuilding its arsenal.
He traveled to Russia a lot trying to get weapons. And when he'd get back, he would be depressed because the Russians never kept their promises.
Under Nasser, Soviet-Egyptian relations had blossomed. But Sadat felt it was a mistake to rely solely on Russian backing.
Anwar al-Sadat had a Western inclination for so long. He didn't like the Soviet Union and wished within himself for the United States to solve the problem.
Sadat once famously said that if the Middle East was a deck of cards, then America held 99% of them.
It was clear that the United States stood 100% with Israel. So it was, in President Sadat's opinion, very important to drive a wedge, if I may say so, or to try to introduce an Egyptian element to this bilateral relations between the United States and Israel.
In July 1972, Sadat expelled 8,000 Soviet military experts from Egypt. If the move was calculated to attract American attention, then it succeeded.
We began to have a second look and a third look and a fourth look at President Sadat. And we said, well, there is an opportunity here. And certainly we ought to explore what the man really has in mind.
In February 1973, Sadat's special advisor, Hafez Ismail, was invited to Washington to meet President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger.
Dr. Kissinger said that you cannot expect to win on the negotiating table what you lost on the battlefield.
But Sadat insisted that control of the Sinai was non-negotiable and that the land would be retaken by force if necessary.
I can say to you in all candor, we didn't believe him. We didn't know Sadat very well. His reputation at that time was, and I mean no derogatory evaluation, his reputation at that time was as a hot-headed nationalist.
Wounded by Israel's dismissive attitude and the American condescension, Sadat calculated that he would only be taken seriously by going on the offensive. The Egyptian president coordinated with his Syrian counterpart, Hafez al-Assad, on plans to launch war against Israel. But the Syrian president was kept in the dark about Sadat's grand scheme.
Sadat never admitted to Assad that his war aims were very limited. He merely wanted to cross the canal and stay there. And he believed if he simply captured a few inches of territory on the eastern side of the canal, that would be sufficient to bring Israel to the negotiating table.
On October the 6th, 1973, in a joint operation, the Syrians attacked in the Golan Heights as Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal, capturing a narrow strip of land in Sinai, but went no further.
The Syrians sent several messages, of course, to Egypt to find out what was going on. Why weren't the Egyptians attacking? Nobody seemed to understand. And of course, nobody had a clue to Sadat's secret diplomacy. He thought he'd struck a great blow, and that was sufficient.
After 3 weeks of fierce fighting and with a fragile UN ceasefire in place, Sadat's dreams came true. In November 1973, Henry Kissinger arrived in Cairo for talks, a visit that Sadat had been anticipating for a long time.
When he first met with Sadat, they talked about world strategy, China, Russia, global balance of power. And Sadat loved being treated like, a big statesman. So they didn't just talk about the little, you have this little problem with Israel. And from then on, he thought that with Sadat, he had a negotiating partner who could think big.
Sadat's tactics seemed to have won the day when Kissinger brokered 2 agreements between Egypt and Israel. Richard Nixon's visit to Egypt in 1974 appeared to emphasize this new relationship. Officially, he received a hero's welcome, as Sadat became infatuated with the West.
He had this illusion that if he could ever become the good friend of the United States, the way Israel was, everything would get better for Egypt. Egypt would get the technology, the science, the investment, and would become a modern country without his having to do very much.
Sadat proclaimed the 1973 October War to be the last war and began to adopt Western-style free market economic policies, abandoning the socialist ideals of Nasser's era. Subsidies for basic foods were removed, a deeply unpopular decision that brought a large number of protesters onto the streets in early 1977. 2 days of rioting and looting ensued, and large parts of the capital were torched.
President Sadat described the bread riots as demonstrations of thieves. He believed that his regime's legitimacy was dissolving on the streets, and that the opposition was unified against him for social reasons. Therefore, he wanted to ambush it.
Sadat needed to find a way to divert attention from the consequences of his social and economic policies. And before the end of the year, 1977, he had succeeded. November the 9th, 1977. President Anwar Sadat addresses a packed Egyptian People's Assembly. It was an annual address, but nobody was prepared for his announcement.
تدهش إسرائيل إنما تسمعني الآن أقول أمامكم أنني مستعد أن أذهب إلى بيتهم إلى الكنيسة ذاته ومناقشتهم.
Sadat was a complicated man, but he did every now and then take a big jump rather than a little one.
And Sadat was taking a leap of faith when he landed at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv on November the 17th, 1977. As he stepped into the spotlight with the whole world watching, the Egyptian president demonstrated his increasing flair for publicity.
Since its invention, the video camera was used to broadcast events, but to force all the cameras in the world to follow you while you are doing something so new, that was genius.
Sadat was something of an actor. He loved to be on the world stage, and he loved to play the roles. People said he used to want to be an actor on the stage, and this was the biggest stage in the world.
Having endured a period of enormous unpopularity as president, Sadat was now reveling in his new title, the Peacemaker. Sadat's speech in the Knesset emphasized the concept of comprehensive peace in the Middle East.
I have made myself clear. I'm not at all aiming at a bilateral agreement between me and Israel or an Egyptian-Israeli settlement for the problem, because it is not an Egyptian-Israeli problem. It is an Arab problem.
But putting words into action would prove far more challenging. His negotiating counterparts were some of Israel's most hard-line right-wing politicians, headed by the Prime Minister, Menachem Begin.
Sadat did not understand how hard it was going to be. He really thought it was going to be easy after he broke what he called the psychological wall.
The peace effort suffered many setbacks, but under American sponsorship, President Jimmy Carter invited Egyptian and Israeli representatives to Camp David in September 1978. The talks dragged on for a fortnight without a breakthrough, but as the clock ticked, Sadat began to give ground.
He had to choose between declaring his historic initiative as a failure or to accept peace with Begin on these terms. And I think Carter put a lot of pressure on him to accept these terms. And these terms meant betraying the Palestinian people.
For Sadat's foreign minister, Ibrahim Kamil, this betrayal was unforgivable, and he refused to take any further part in negotiations. He resigned a matter of hours before the deadlock was broken, leaving the president solely responsible for making a bilateral peace agreement with the Arab world's sworn enemy.
Sadat was very clear that this was the first step. If we insisted that we get the agreement of all the Arab countries, we would not be able to get that.
Salam, shalom, and to peace.
By now, Sadat was more convinced than ever that the destiny of the Middle East lay in American hands. But Sadat's beloved Egypt was ostracized from the Arab world, expelled from the Arab League that it had helped form. Its headquarters in Cairo were closed down. And Sadat himself had become an outcast.
The Syrian radio and TV channels went on calling Anwar al-Sadat a traitor, who gave up his land, who gave up his cause. These harsh accusations should never be made among brothers. We should rise above them. Of course we could differ, maybe not all agree with what Anwar al-Sadat did, but not be that insulting.
Yet, his isolation only made him more determined to finish what he'd started. And in 1979, under the watchful eye of the US president, he finally signed the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty.
Sadat was a gambler with a grand sweep of history in his outlook and rhetoric, willing to take chances. He took an enormous gamble in signing the peace treaty with Israel, but he got what he fundamentally wanted, which was all of Sinai, without any residual Israeli presence.
With this roll of the dice, Egypt's era of political and cultural dominance in the Arab world was over.
President Sadat believed Egypt had to isolate itself from the Arab world and remove itself from the Arab-Israeli conflict. Sadat almost announced a kind of a regional divorce from Arabism.
But within Egypt, he treated this divorce as a victory, mindful as ever of his media image. Huge government-orchestrated celebrations were held as Israeli forces evacuated parts of Sinai according to schedule. And Sadat promised the people that they would reap the dividends of peace.
He tried to appeal to popular instincts that things would radically improve, and blamed all ills on the wars, defending the Palestinian cause and the Arabs. This was the beginning of a point where he misled the people for some time, but he could not fool them all the time.
Presenting himself as Egypt's father figure, Sadat stressed his humble origins, often visiting the village of his birth while dressed traditionally as a man of the people. But the people themselves were now suffering as the promised economic miracle failed to materialize. Rejection of the president's policies, both domestic and international, united the previously fragmented Egyptian opposition. And just as he had done when faced with opposition from Nasserites a decade earlier, Sadat launched a crackdown, but this time on a much wider scale.
It is a purge
and I'm not eliminating the opposition like some of you have seen.
He spared no one, from the church to the mosque to the Muslim Brotherhood to the Nasarites, the liberals and the leftists. He accused them of treason and threw them in jail.
But this time, his enemies could not be silenced. On the 6th of October 1981, Sadat led the military parade in Cairo, an annual show of strength for his armed forces, a potent symbol, it seemed, of the all-powerful presidency. But 4 assassins, belonging to an Islamist militant group, penetrated this ring of steel. Sadat was rushed to hospital, but it would be too late.
I went in the operation room and found the president lying in bed, covered. It was glaringly clear before me. I had a kind of internal conflict, making me not believe what I saw. I found myself unconsciously throwing myself on him and crying. It was a difficult situation. He was a husband, a father, a lover. He was my everything.
The mourners at Sadat's state funeral reflected the path that he'd taken as Egypt's president. The presence of Western leaders, including a prominent Israeli delegation, emphasized the complete absence of Arabic heads of state. The guests were surrounded by an extremely tight security cordon, one that excluded the regular Egyptian people, if any had chosen to attend.
We disagree with some, with perhaps too much rapprochement with the Americans. We disagree with some of his policies, but he was a visionary. And I now must admit that he saw things as we did not see.
A few days later, Sadat's vice president, Hosni Mubarak, was chosen as the new president. Anwar Sadat had appointed General Hosni Mubarak, the then commander of the Egyptian Air Force, as his vice president in 1976. To some observers, it seemed a bizarre choice, but one that provided an insight into Sadat's personality.
He followed the advice of Machiavelli, who wrote that you should not hire people from the elites because they can become your competitors. Hire those who are in the lower ranks because they will be very obedient and loyal.
Almost 30 years later, Sadat's legacy remains in the shape of a president chosen by him and not by the Egyptian people.